The sound of war often begins in a foundry, a rhythm of hammer on metal, of molten metal hissing as it meets the cold, and the low, practical conversation of men who build things to be trusted with lives. The Mk2 pineapple grenade was born in that register, between the echo of industry and the cold logic of ordnance boards. It did not arrive as romance, it arrived as necessity. By the late 1930s, armies were thinking about how to give the individual soldier more than a rifle and a prayer. Close quarters fighting, trench raids, bunker clearing. These were tasks for which the little hand grenade had already proved its value. But the scale and lethality required for modern war demanded something standardized, robust, and reliably lethal. The Mk2 emerged as America's answer. Heavy, serrated, unmistakable in silhouette, and meant to be trusted by the man who gripped it in his fist. From the outside, it looked almost friendly. A cast-iron shell, patterned like a fruit. That texture was intentional. The brake lines and raised segments were designed for grip in wet or muddy hands. Inside, however, engineering and a ruthless calculus of effect governed every cubic inch. The Mk2 used a delay fuse and a high-explosive filling chosen to produce fragmentation rather than a single, clean blast. The goal was simple and brutal: turn one small object into hundreds of deadly pieces that would convert a single blast into an area weapon. Early design meetings were dominated by questions that read more like equations than poetry. What thickness yields the most lethal fragmentation? Which alloy gives the most predictable shattering? How long should the fuse delay be so an attacker can hurl and take cover? Engineers ran test after test, adjusting charges and casing hardness until the grenade performed consistently. What the manuals valued most was predictability. In the chaos of combat, a soldier needed to be able to count on the toy in his hand to behave the way training said it would. The first field demonstrations were almost ceremonial. Officers in wool coats watched ordnance teams hurl Mk2s into empty fields, while observers measured effective radii and recorded fragment patterns. But the laboratory is not the same as a training range, and a training range is not the same as a battlefield filled with buildings, walls, soil, and the human bodies of the living and wounded. It was in that step from bench to field where the first hard lesson arrived. Engineers and ordnance officers, methodical men used to numbers, began to notice anomalies. Shrapnel flying farther than expected when the grenade detonated above hard ground. Fragments skipping off stone facades and sailing into the next field. Data sheets recorded velocities and fragment mass, and then, in margins scrawled with more concern than certainty, distances. Fragments occasionally carried lethal energy well beyond the standard safety circle. In controlled tests, the lethal radius averaged where doctrine placed it. In the rough geometry of training grounds and villages, it did not always behave so politely. That discovery, that fragments could travel farther than soldiers believed safe, spread through the army not as a memo, but as a sharpened whisper. Training officers began to alter their commands. What had once been a casual habit, throw and take cover, became a drilled choreography. Step out, throw, lie flat, press face to wet earth, expose as little as possible. Drill sergeants, who had always been the blunt instruments of habit and repetition, now had a new urgency. They would demonstrate on ranges not only the arc of the throw, but the arc of the fragment field, laying out cloth markers that marked the outer edges of possible danger. In bivouacs and barracks, men who had spent months learning to trust the device found themselves suddenly squinting at the painted metal fruit and counting the meters between themselves and their comrades. The shock was both technical and deeply personal. Men who had trained with the Mk2 wrote home about the new rules as if they were reporting a change in the weather. The grenade was still a friend, powerful, faithful, but it also required new humility. Instructors told recruits the story they would not forget. Stand too close, and the thing you trusted to protect your squad could take you with it. Some of the most wrenching lessons came from the range accidents. A trainee who failed to lie flat, a belt of fragments that matched nothing in the textbook. Those accidents rippled outward. Commanders rewrote standing orders. Platoon leaders moved their throwers to the flanks. Squad formations shifted to ensure that a man throwing would not have his back to men down range. The doctrine of aggression, throw, and advance was tempered by a more cautious choreography. Throw, drop, protect. At the same time, the Mk2's potency reshaped tactics in small unit combat. In the close streets of a European village, a well-timed grenade could clear a room, crush a machine gun nest, or deny an enemy a hedgerow. In assault doctrine, it became an equalizer. Soldiers could neutralize fortified positions that previously required heavy weapons or prolonged artillery. Commanders learned to pair grenadiers with riflemen in tight drills. The thrower would shape the enemy's response. The rifleman would exploit the opening. But beneath those tactical gains ran the uncomfortable recognition that the weapon's fragments were an indiscriminate force. When used in high-density terrain, when buildings reflected metal like mirrors, the danger to friend as well as foe increased. The instrument that allowed a platoon to live through a trench charge could also mutilate the unwary man who forgot to press his cheek into the dirt. By the time the United States fully mobilized, the Mk2 had been both canonized and cautioned. Manuals printed in stark type told soldiers to throw and lie flat. But at the squad level, the advice turned into something more human. Watch for the man next to you. Don't be the man who stands to look. Veterans would later recall the moment their sergeant first taught them to drop. How in the milliseconds after a grenade left the thrower's hand, the company somehow held its breath. The grenade was a compact paradox. It offered potent control over the battlefield while demanding a new humility from its wielder. That paradox, of a soldier trusting an object capable of saving and killing, would become the emotional center of an entire generation's combat experience. And so the Mk2 entered the war as both tool and teacher. It taught ordnance boards and grunts alike that power must be married to caution, that industrial certainty must give way to the messy geometry of ground and buildings. It would save lives, and in the wrong moment, take them. In the weeks that followed these early revelations, training would harden, SOPs would change, and every recruit would be told again and again to hit the dirt the instant the grenade left his hand. The message was simple, and it was heavy with consequence. Respect the metal in your palm, and the metal will sometimes let you go home. You misrespected, and distance becomes the measure between survival and loss.
The reports began quietly, short, clipped memoranda typed on thick paper and stamped Ordnance Board Confidential. They came from proving grounds like Aberdeen, Camp Robinson, and Fort Benning, each describing the same unsettling pattern. Fragments from the Mk2 grenade were traveling far beyond the designated safe zone. The official manuals claimed the effective casualty radius was 15 yards and the danger radius around 50. But field testing told another story, one that made every range officer in the U.S. Army uneasy. When engineers detonated grenades over hard-packed soil or concrete, their measuring grids began to look like maps of chaos. Instead of a neat ring of destruction, fragments scattered in erratic lines, some reaching 70, 80, even 100 yards from the blast point. One test recorded a steel fragment lodged in a wooden wall 123 yards away, still traveling fast enough to kill. The ordnance officer who witnessed it scribbled a note in the margin of his report. This result cannot be ignored. The Mk2, it turned out, was not just powerful, it was unpredictable. The cast-iron body, once believed to break into uniform chunks, shattered in wild, asymmetric ways. Each detonation was unique, a fingerprint of violence. Some grenades broke into dozens of small fragments, others into just a few large, razor-edged shards that flew like shrapnel artillery. The problem wasn't faulty design, it was physics. The steel grooves on the grenade's surface, the famous pineapple pattern, weren't actually meant to control fragmentation as many soldiers believed. They were meant for grip. The real pattern of destruction came from invisible imperfections within the metal itself. Stress lines, air pockets, casting flaws, the unseen architecture of chaos. To the men in the field, this discovery meant something brutally simple. No one was safe. You could throw the grenade perfectly, drop to the ground exactly as trained, and still be struck by a fragment bouncing off rock or ricocheting through a doorway. The instructors began to treat the weapon with a new, almost superstitious respect. When you throw it, one sergeant told his recruits, get flat and start praying to whoever's on duty that day. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground, the tests became more methodical. Engineers built wooden grids, hung sheets of thin steel at varying distances, and detonated Mk2s under every condition imaginable. Open fields, concrete floors, trenches, even snow. They collected fragments by hand, measuring their mass and velocity. The results were always the same. Fragments of lethal weight routinely exceeded the supposed safety radius. They discovered that even a fragment weighing less than a gram could travel at over 700 feet per second. At that speed, a piece of jagged steel the size of a fingernail could punch through a helmet or a man's chest. A confidential report from 1943 summarized it bluntly. Tests indicate that the Mk2 fragmentation pattern exceeds anticipated limits of lethality. Effective casualty radius may extend to 100 yards in certain terrains. In simpler terms, the grenade could kill its thrower as easily as its target. When these results reached training officers, the reaction was a mix of disbelief and dread. Many had trained with the Mk2 for years, teaching men to throw it from trenches, behind walls, or from foxholes just yards away from other troops. Now they realized that what had been considered a safe distance was an illusion. Some instructors began ordering their men to double the safety perimeter. Others rewrote their own rules entirely. At Camp Roberts, California, an entire platoon of recruits was forced to spend hours lying prone after each throw until the instructors were satisfied that every fragment had landed. "We called it the longest 10 seconds in the Army," one trainee said later. Yet paradoxically, the danger made soldiers respect the weapon even more. The Mk2 became a sort of ritual object, handled carefully, thrown decisively, feared even in training. There was a grim humor about it too. Soldiers joked that it had a long reach or that the pineapple doesn't care who it hits. But beneath the jokes was a quiet tension. Everyone had heard a story. The trainee hit by a fragment on the next range, the corporal who stood up too soon, the patrol that lost a man to their own grenade bouncing off a wall. These weren't myths, they were warnings. By 1944, the Ordnance Department had standardized new precautions. Training manuals now instructed soldiers to throw and immediately seek cover, no hesitation. Instructors added new diagrams showing the danger radius expanding outward like ripples in water. A special paragraph was included in the FM 2330 Grenades and Pyrotechnic Signals Manual. Fragments may travel farther than the prescribed danger radius under certain conditions. When throwing, all personnel are to assume the prone position and remain down for no less than 5 seconds. But even with these new rules, unpredictability remained part of the Mk2's character. Terrain can change everything. In soft earth, fragments might bury themselves almost instantly. On frozen ground or in city streets, they could skip and ricochet like bullets. In jungle warfare, as U.S. troops would soon learn in the Philippines, the grenade could detonate in the canopy, raining fragments in every direction, including back toward the thrower. The irony wasn't lost on the engineers. The grenade they had built to save lives in close combat was also teaching the military a hard lesson about respecting explosive power. One ordnance colonel summed it up during a safety meeting at Fort Benning. "The Mk2 is not a gentleman's weapon. It's democracy in a casing. It kills everything it can reach." It was an ugly truth, but one that every soldier had to live with. As the war expanded, word of these findings filtered down to the front lines. Infantrymen began to adapt instinctively. In Europe, they learned to throw from behind tank holes or over rubble. In the Pacific, Marines threw them low and fast, bouncing them into enemy trenches to avoid upward spray. Veterans called it grenade wisdom, the instincts you only earned by surviving your own explosions. The Mk2 didn't just change tactics, it changed posture, timing, and even psychology. Men no longer trusted distance. They trusted dirt, cover, and the seconds they counted in their heads. They learned to fear silence, that tiny moment after the throw when the world held its breath before the blast. In those tenth seconds, they weren't just fighting the enemy, they were fighting physics, the unpredictable chaos born inside every cast iron shell. And in that struggle, the Mk2 became something more than a weapon. It became a reminder that power, even in the hands of the just, comes with its own hunger, its own will to reach farther than intended. The engineers had built a grenade to win wars, but what they had truly made was a lesson that even control has its limits. As 1944 turned to 1945 and the fighting intensified across Europe and the Pacific, that lesson would be written in blood and shrapnel. From the training ranges of Georgia to the foxholes of Bastogne, the soldiers who threw the Mk2 had learned the truth. You didn't use it, you negotiated with it.
The first soldiers to truly understand the Mk2's power weren't those who faced the enemy, they were the ones who faced their own grenades. Training ranges across America, from Camp Roberts in California to Fort Benning in Georgia, became the proving grounds not just for skill, but for fear. The Army had begun to realize that the Mk2 wasn't a simple tool, it was a pact with destruction. Every recruit who held one knew it. The line between mastery and tragedy was a heartbeat long. At Camp Hood in 1943, a training instructor named Sergeant Howard Leeds demonstrated the proper throwing technique to a group of wide-eyed recruits. He had done it 100 times before. Pull the pen, hold the spoon, count 1, 2, 3, and throw. The grenade arced cleanly into the pit, landing with a dull thud. The explosion sent a sharp crack across the field, and then something unexpected. A fragment whistled past and struck a wooden post 90 yards behind them. The class fell silent. Leeds turned to his men and said quietly, "That's why you hug the dirt." Stories like that became lessons carved into the Army's collective muscle memory. Instructors began each live throw session with the same warning. When you throw, you drop, and you don't look up till you hear it die. Soldiers practiced that reflex until it was instinct, a choreography of survival. Throw, drop, count, breathe. But even perfect training couldn't prevent every tragedy. The Mk2 had no favorites. At Fort Bragg, a recruit in Company F panicked mid-throw. The pin came out, the grenade slipped from his hand, and it landed between him and the sergeant beside him. The drill sergeant didn't hesitate. He shoved the recruit into the trench and covered him with his own body as the grenade detonated. The instructor survived, barely. The recruit didn't speak for 3 days. The base commander later wrote in his report, "The grenade behaved as designed. The human heart behaved better." Even in safe hands, danger found ways to linger. Fragments from training detonations sometimes flew past adjacent ranges, slicing through sandbags or tents. At Camp Robinson, a fragment from a live throw pit tore through a mess hall roof 80 yards away, embedding itself in a support beam. Nobody was injured, but that fragment, still hot, still humming, was mounted later in the officers' quarters with a brass plate beneath it. Respect distance. The Army took the message to heart. Training pits were redesigned, observation towers were reinforced, instructors began enforcing a new rule: no spectators within 150 yards during live throw sessions. Posters appeared on barrack walls: "Fragments have no friends." But discipline alone wasn't enough. The grenade demanded respect born not from fear, but from familiarity, and that meant repetition. Thousands of men threw Mk2s until the weight of its pineapple-shaped body felt like an extension of their palm, heavy, warm, alive. When they deployed overseas, that familiarity would save them, and sometimes still kill them. In combat, Normandy, 1944, the hedgerows were thick, the fields tight, and visibility short. Small squads advanced in silence, clearing one farmhouse at a time. For most soldiers, the grenade was a trusted opener, a way to clear rooms without walking into them.
But on June 15th, Private Lester Ed Red Harmon of the 2nd Infantry Division learned how quickly that trust could turn. Harmon tossed a grenade through a window of a French barn occupied by German machine gunners. The blast cleared the room, but a fragment punched through the wooden wall and struck the platoon's medic 60 yards away. The medic survived, but Harmon never forgot. He wrote home later, "I threw it to save them, and it nearly killed my own." That contradiction, power and peril intertwined, haunted the front lines. The Mk2 could devastate an enemy squad in an instant, but it required space, timing, and absolute awareness. American doctrine began to evolve on the ground. Soldiers learned to shout, "Frag out," before throwing, a warning born of instinct long before it became standard procedure. Units adopted the 5-second rule: throw, drop, and never rise before the echo fades. In the ruins of Aachen, a city turned to concrete dust. The grenade became a language of its own. Infantrymen tossed Mk2s down stairwells, through shattered windows, into cellars filled with German defenders. The confined spaces turned each explosion into a thunderclap. Shards of concrete mixed with iron fragments. After clearing one building, a lieutenant wrote in his journal, "We learned to fear our own echoes. Every wall can throw back death." The war's harshest lesson came during the Battle of the Bulge, when the snow turned every grenade shockwave into a ricochet. Frozen ground reflected the blast outward, sending fragments skipping across the ice. A patrol from the 99th Division lost 2 men that winter, not to the enemy, but to their own grenades exploding too close on frozen soil. Survivors later remembered the sight, a field glittering with tiny shards of steel under the moonlight, like the stars had fallen to earth. In the Pacific, the lessons were even bloodier. Jungle fighting blurred distance and direction. In the tangle of vines and trees, every throw risked hitting a branch and detonating too early. On Guadalcanal, Marines learned to throw low, bouncing grenades into enemy foxholes instead of lobbing them. At Tarawa, one squad of the 2nd Marine Division lost 3 men when a grenade exploded in a palm thicket, fragments slicing back through their own line. After that, veterans passed down a simple rule: if you can't see the ground it's going to hit, don't throw. But even amid that chaos, the Mk2 proved indispensable. Its compact power broke defenses that rifles couldn't touch. In a tunnel complex on Luzon, a bazooka team trapped by Japanese troops used grenades to seal off tunnels one by one. The explosions were deafening, echoing through the rock until the men could feel the shockwaves in their teeth. It was like shaking hands with lightning, one of them said afterward. You knew it could turn on you, but you shook anyway. Every grenade thrown was a tiny act of faith. Soldiers trusted the 4-second fuse, the cast iron casing, the choreography of motion. Yet, even with all their training, accidents shadowed them. A pin pulled too early, a fuse that burned too fast, a fragment that found the wrong target. The Army kept meticulous records, but behind each statistic was a name, a friend, a body carried to the aid station. By 1945, the Mk2 had earned its reputation as both savior and executioner. Soldiers still loved it, for its simplicity, for its certainty, but they never forgot what it demanded in return. It wasn't a weapon to be thrown casually. It was a weapon to be survived. In after-action reports, officers began writing phrases that would become doctrine for generations to come. Throw from cover whenever possible. Lie flat immediately after release. No man stands after he throws. The Mk2 had taught its users not just how to kill, but how to endure, how to live within inches of death and still fight on. It had turned battlefields into classrooms, each explosion a lesson in humility. And as the war entered its final phase, from the jungles of the Pacific to the ruins of Germany, those lessons would follow every soldier who carried the pineapple-shaped grenade on his belt, because by then, they all knew, when you pulled that pin, you weren't just throwing a weapon, you were gambling with the invisible mathematics of fate, and hoping that, just for one more day, physics and fortune would be on your side.
By the 4th week of December 1944, Bastogne had become a frozen island of exhaustion. The snow no longer looked white. It was gray, churned by boots, stained with smoke and blood. The men of the 101st Airborne Division and the 10th Armored Division had been under siege for nearly 10 days, and time itself had frozen with them. The temperature dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Food was scarce, water turned to ice, and the human body became a machine of endurance. Fingers split open, lips bled, eyelids froze together at night. And through it all, the Browning M1919A4 crews kept their posts, half buried in snow, feeding belts of ammunition through guns that had long since become extensions of their own bodies. Sleep was a luxury none could afford. Every few hours, a German artillery barrage would sweep across the lines, followed by probing attacks. The enemy seemed endless. Volksgrenadiers, Waffen-SS, paratroopers, all fighting under the same gray sky. Between battles, there was silence. Not peace, but a silence so heavy it pressed on the chest. You could hear your own heartbeat, one gunner remembered. Then you'd hear the Browning, and you knew someone else was still alive. The crews no longer spoke much. Their world had shrunk to a rhythm. Feed the belt, fire, clear the snow from the barrel, count the rounds, and start again. Their gloves were stiff with frozen sweat, their hands cracked and blackened by frostbite. When the guns iced over, they used bayonets to chip the bolts free. Some gunners removed their gloves entirely to feel the weapon better, skin fusing briefly to the steel before tearing away. They joked that the gun had tasted blood and that it liked it. The assistant gunners worked beside them in silence, pushing stiff belts into the feed tray with trembling hands. Each belt weighed several pounds, each bullet a small promise of survival. They moved like ghosts in the fog, faces pale and hollow. Yet there was something sacred in their work. "You didn't think of it as fighting," wrote Private Lawrence Moffett, a Browning assistant in the 502nd Parachute Infantry. "It was like keeping a fire alive. You fed it, kept it breathing, because if it went out, everything went dark." Sometimes the snow fell so thick that it muffled the gunfire entirely. The men could barely see 10 feet ahead. When the Germans attacked under that curtain of white, they appeared like phantoms, their outlines barely visible until they were almost on top of the line. Then the Brownings erupted, long, sustained bursts that shattered the silence. The muzzle flashes lit up the night like lightning. The crews fired until they couldn't tell if the steam rising around them was from the gun or their own breath. Inside Bastogne, the hospital basements overflowed. Medics worked by candlelight, the wounded wrapped in blankets that never got warm. They could still hear the machine guns outside, thumping in the distance like heartbeats. One nurse recalled that sound decades later. "Every time a Browning fired, I thought, someone's still fighting for us." On the northern perimeter, near Foy, a Browning crew led by Sergeant William McCarlin held a small farmhouse turned strongpoint. The Germans had hit them 3 times already that night, and the ammunition was almost gone. Harlan's assistant gunner was dead, and his replacement, a 19-year-old from Iowa, had frostbite so bad he could barely move his hands. Still, they refused to abandon the gun. When the next wave came, Harlan told his partner to hold the feed belt steady, then fired from the hip, sweeping the doorway. He held down the trigger until the barrel glowed orange. When it finally jammed, he drew his sidearm and kept firing until the snow went quiet again. The gun was part of him, a survivor later said. He didn't know where it ended, and he began. These weren't isolated acts of heroism. They were routine. Every Browning crew had its breaking point, and every one of them crossed it. The machine didn't just demand ammunition, it demanded willpower. You had to want it to live. Soldiers burned rations and spare socks for warmth, poured coffee or melted snow over the receiver to keep it cycling. They traded extra belts between foxholes like currency. "One belt could mean a life," said a paratrooper from the 506th PIR. "We'd carry them like gold." The emotional toll was harder to measure. Many men began talking to their guns as if to a comrade. Some even gave them names: Stella, Old Reliable, Betsy. They cleaned them like they were living things, wiping frost from the receiver, whispering promises under their breath. "Come on, girl, don't die on me now." And the gun didn't. There were moments, brief and terrible, when the lines faltered. One sector, manned by the 327th Glider Infantry, was nearly overrun when a Browning crew was hit by mortar fire. The gun fell silent, and the Germans began to advance. A runner carrying ammunition heard the silence and turned back. He found the crew dead, their gun half buried in snow. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees, cleared the jam, and opened fire. The Germans froze. They had thought the line was gone. One man's instincts saved the position. It wasn't courage, he said later. It was the sound of quiet that scared me. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne was a graveyard wrapped in snow. The men hadn't eaten a hot meal in days. Their cigarettes were frozen, their boots cracked. But the Browning crews kept watch over every approach, along the roads, behind the hedgerows, beside the shattered churches. Their guns looked monstrous now, coated in frost, barrels warped from heat and cold, paint burned away. But they still worked. A sergeant in the 10th Armored Division described it perfectly. When everything else failed, radios, trucks, men's bodies, the Browning didn't. It just kept going. It was like the town itself. We were battered, frozen, half dead, but we didn't stop. In that endurance, there was something transcendent. Bastogne was not held by strategy or numbers. It was held by trust. Trust between soldiers, trust between man and machine. Each gun crew was a small brotherhood, bound not by rank, but by survival. They had one mission: keep the line alive. When Christmas morning dawned gray and silent, the men barely noticed the date. They were too tired, too cold. But somewhere along the southern perimeter, a Browning opened up again, a short, sharp burst that echoed through the forest. Then another answered it from the west, and another from the north. Soon the whole ring of Bastogne seemed to hum with gunfire, not a battle, but a kind of song. It wasn't celebration, it was communication, a way of saying, "We're still here." The same three words that had defined their fight, their endurance, their brotherhood. When men finally rotated out after the siege, many refused to leave their guns behind. They would clean them one last time, pack the barrels with snow to cool them, and run their hands over the cold steel like saying goodbye to an old friend. Because in Bastogne, when even God seemed frozen, it was the Brownings and the men who served them that had kept the world from going completely silent.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the men who came home carried two kinds of scars: the ones on their skin and the ones left by the weapons they had trusted. Among those weapons, the Mk2 fragmentation grenade left perhaps the deepest impression, not just on bodies, but on doctrine, design, and memory. It was small enough to fit in a hand, yet its echo would shape the next 70 years of military thinking. The lessons came quickly, written not in theory, but in blood. The Army's ordnance reports after the war were blunt. Fragment dispersion exceeds intended radius under combat conditions. Training manuals were rewritten once again, this time with a kind of reverence that bordered on fear. No longer just a tool, the grenade had become a symbol of both power and humility. The phrase "hit the dirt" became more than instruction, it became gospel. By the late 1940s, engineers set to work on designing a safer replacement. The goal was simple: keep the lethality, tame the chaos. The result was the M26 grenade, nicknamed the Lemon. Instead of the Mk2's cast iron body, which fractured unpredictably, the M26 used a smooth steel shell lined with a controlled fragmentation coil. Every piece of shrapnel would now break in a calculated pattern, reducing the risk to the thrower while maintaining devastating effect. Where the Mk2 relied on nature's randomness, the M26 was mathematics in steel. It was the next logical step in humanity's uneasy relationship with its own inventions. And yet, no matter how refined the design became, soldiers never forgot the first rule they learned from the Mk2: respect the blast. That reflex, throw, drop, stay down, was carried from World War II into Korea, then into Vietnam, and even into the modern training fields of today. The grenade's habits outlived its body.
In that way, the Mk2 became not just a weapon, but a teacher, the invisible instructor behind every safety drill. For the veterans who had used it, though, the legacy was more personal. To them, the Mk2 wasn't just a weapon, it was a companion through the worst days of their lives. In letters, diaries, and reunions decades later, they spoke of it with an odd tenderness, a mix of fear, respect, and reluctant gratitude. At a reunion of the 29th Infantry Division in 1962, an old soldier named Jack Dempsey held up a deactivated Mk2 grenade he'd kept since Normandy. The room fell quiet as he said, "She scared me half to death, and she saved me more times than I'll ever know." When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the men who came home carried two kinds of scars, the ones on their skin and the ones left by the weapons they had trusted. Among those weapons, the Mk2 fragmentation grenade left perhaps the deepest impression, not just on bodies, but on doctrine, design, and memory. It was small enough to fit in a hand, yet its echo would shape the next 70 years of military thinking. The lessons came quickly, written not in theory, but in blood. The Army's ordnance reports after the war were blunt. Fragment dispersion exceeds intended radius under combat conditions. Training manuals were rewritten once again, this time with a kind of reverence that bordered on fear. No longer just a tool, the grenade had become a symbol of both power and humility. The phrase, "hit the dirt," became more than instruction, it became gospel. By the late 1940s, engineers set to work on designing a safer replacement. The goal was simple: keep the lethality, tame the chaos. The result was the M26 grenade, nicknamed the Lemon. Instead of the Mk2's cast iron body, which fractured unpredictably, the M26 used a smooth steel shell lined with a controlled fragmentation coil. Every piece of shrapnel would now break in a calculated pattern, reducing the risk to the thrower while maintaining devastating effect. Where the Mk2 relied on nature's randomness, the M26 was mathematics in steel. It was the next logical step in humanity's uneasy relationship with its own inventions. And yet, no matter how refined the design became, soldiers never forgot the first rule they learned from the Mk2: respect the blast. That reflex, throw, drop, stay down, was carried from World War II into Korea, then into Vietnam, and even into the modern training fields of today. The grenade's habits outlived its body. In that way, the Mk2 became not just a weapon, but a teacher, the invisible instructor behind every safety drill. For the veterans who had used it, though, the legacy was more personal. To them, the Mk2 wasn't just a weapon, it was a companion through the worst days of their lives. In letters, diaries, and reunions decades later, they spoke of it with an odd tenderness, a mix of fear, respect, and reluctant gratitude. At a reunion of the 29th Infantry Division in 1962, an old soldier named Jack Dempsey held up a deactivated Mk2 grenade he'd kept since Normandy. The room fell quiet as he said, "She scared me half to death, and she saved me more times than I'll ever know." He passed it around the room, and one by one the men touched it like a relic. To them, it was a reminder of youth, chaos, and the razor's edge between life and death. Another veteran, Private First Class Roy Carter, who had fought on Luzon, told an interviewer, "Every time I pulled that pin, I wondered if that would be the one that came back for me. But I never stopped throwing, because when it worked like nothing else." Those men understood something that no manual could teach, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act alongside it. The Mk2 had demanded that kind of courage every time it left a hand. It made its users live inside that 3-second window of total vulnerability, waiting for an explosion that might save them or destroy them. In those moments, every soldier came face to face with the paradox of modern war.
that survival now depended on mastering something designed to kill indiscriminately. In museums today, the Mk2 sits behind glass, inert, silent, stripped of its terror. Tourists peer at it with curiosity, some even smiling at its almost cartoonish shape. Few realize that the grooves on its body once shredded through helmets, walls, and human flesh alike. Fewer still understand that every line carved into that casing was a chapter in a manual written in fear. The placard beneath it might list specifications: 1 pound, 7 ounces, 60 millisecond fuse delay, cast iron body, explosive filler, TNT or EC powder. But what it doesn't list are the thousands of men who learned what it meant to handle that much power with trembling hands. The true legacy of the Mk2 isn't its range or its kill radius or the fact that fragments could fly 100 yards. Its legacy lies in the discipline it taught. It forced soldiers to think before they acted, to measure distance not just in yards but in lives. It shaped the moral geometry of battle, that fragile understanding that every decision carries consequences beyond sight. As the decades passed, the Mk2 faded from arsenals but lived on in memory. It appeared in films, in books, and in the collective imagination of a world that had learned to industrialize destruction. It became an icon, the pineapple grenade, shorthand for World War II itself. Its silhouette, simple and brutal, was tattooed on veterans' arms, painted on helmets, printed on war posters. It was the emblem of an era when the ordinary soldier held the fate of life and death in one small motion. And even as newer weapons arrived, digital, guided, precise, the old lessons endured. Modern soldiers still train with the same choreography: pull, throw, drop, breathe. The technology has changed, the humility has not. The invisible handshake between man and explosion remains, passed down through generations of warriors who understand that the smallest weapon often carries the loudest truth. In the quiet halls of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, one exhibit tells the story plainly. Beneath a faded field manual and a rusted Mk2 grenade, a quote is etched into the glass: "We were told to throw and hit the ground because fragments don't care about uniforms." It's an epitaph in its own way, not just for the weapon, but for the men who lived by that rule. The Mk2 reminded them that in war, control is an illusion, and survival is earned in seconds of instinct and discipline. When asked years later what it felt like to use the grenade, one veteran simply said, "It felt like holding the war in your hand." He wasn't wrong. The Mk2 was war, condensed, small, brutal, efficient, and honest about what it demanded. It didn't just change tactics, it changed soldiers. It taught them fear, respect, and the impossible balance between power and caution. And so long after the last Mk2 was thrown, its echo remains. In every safety drill, in every soldier's reflex to hit the ground, in every lesson that reminds humanity to fear its own creations just enough to survive them. Because the grenade they trusted could kill at one